Okay, so Rachel Rozanski is an interdisciplinary artist and PhD researcher whose creative practice integrates geology, environmental science, and disability studies. Her work investigates concepts of restoration and repair, focusing on how ecological and bodily systems are shaped by human intervention and environmental change. Today, she's going to talk to us about a sublime blunder, anthropogenic grains composing the Leslie spit. So I'll hand over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Um, I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to talk about one component of my PhD project. Um, and I'm working on this with Dr. Patricia Corcoran, and I'll talk about that later. So just to give you a brief introduction, in 2018, I moved to Toronto, but very accidentally, actually to a small spit off of the city itself. And this is an area where nobody's actually allowed to live, but we did. It's this industrialized and then largely abandoned piece of land that's jutting out into Lake Ontario. And I didn't know anything about the place at the time, but I noticed that it was one of the more, quote unquote, green spaces around. It was really populated with quite a lot of plants and animals living on or in the industrial rubble. There was this beach I would go to swim at every day. It was pretty gross, but at the same time, I was developing chronic pain, and the cold water helped my symptoms. So on these daily trips to the water, I started noticing that everywhere I went, I could see or smell dead animals, and actually so much so that I started looking into this place to begin with. And when I did, my home became very complicated to me because even though it isn't very clean or very safe necessarily, it is one of the now rare unclaimed spaces that lets us be there at all. Um, So I'm mainly an artist, and I'm doing my PhD in interdisciplinary humanities. I'm using environmental humanities and geology to explore the space from a scientific perspective, analyzing this fairly new piece of land with very anthropogenic origins. And I'm also using disability studies to look at those findings from a broader social context, exploring ideas of cure and how certain fantasies of restoration are applied to both sick bodies and damaged landscapes similarly. I'm interested in these relationships between environmental change and so-called invisible illness in the Anthropocene and how environmental planning can be built up through a particular collection of images and stories that are made then real. So I bring these sometimes seemingly distant topics together through research and visuals. And my plan is to ultimately make a photo book out of this. And one of the things I find really exciting about this project, and especially the component I'm talking about today, which is my research with Patricia, is that it's a very interdisciplinary project, and the science is a necessary part of the art. And my hope is for the art to do more than just portray the science, but to be an important part of the research and to interpret and then expand it into a sociopolitical sphere. Um, so, just to introduce this place a little bit more, the Toronto Portlands and Leslie Spit make up a single peninsula into Lake Ontario off of downtown Toronto. And they were originally a wetland, and then in 1959 started becoming this massive land built up out of the city's industrial waste. It was built up mainly out of construction rubble and probably some residential as well. And this continues even today, and the land continues expanding with this. So over the years, the site hosted a lot of industry as well. There's still some going on. And you can see here the expansion of it by the year the dumping was done. And it's pretty fascinating to pair those up because the material does vary quite a bit from one beach to the next. The combined shoreline of the Spit and the Portlands includes up to 15 kilometers of rubble that are exposed all to Lake Ontario. The shoreline's a really interesting, layered geologic record of urban refuse with a lot of bricks, tile, porcelain, concrete, slag, plastics, rubber, and other waste. And um, It really, you can see here on the left, the beach you're looking at looks quite a bit like natural rock, but most of it is not. So since construction of the spit started in 1959, it was using a lot of non-controlled fill, and it wasn't until 1982 that any lake fill quality guidelines were introduced. But even then, not very well. Some reports were very critical of these guidelines, and probably most of the trucks sampled exceeded acceptable levels. In a lot of these samples and these findings, there's arsenic, PCBs, mercury, cadmium, zinc, etc., other potentially harmful elements that were definitely over the allowed thresholds. And since then, no research has been done on the toxins that exist in most of the materials that make up this entire shoreline as they continue wearing down. So Patricia Corcoran is one of my committee members who's an earth scientist and geologist, and I'm working with her on this paper. And she kindly showed me how to do class counting of the anthropogenic material that we found makes up most of the beaches. And some of these look almost entirely like natural rock, as you can see, until you really get up close. And we looked at 4 different beaches spread across the area. So scientifically, we are doing class counts. Then we started SEM, but the surfaces were too rough. So the next step is to redo EDX, but with smooth, polished surfaces. We're also sending powders for trace element analysis. And this is a little bit of what we've found so far. Each of these correlate to tests of different rocks, which there are many more of. And a lot of them do contain trace amounts of zinc, cadmium, cobalt, chromium, lead, copper, more. So one thing I kept finding that I really liked out of this is the recurrence of blue as a theme. And the blue and green rocks tend to have more toxic elements. There also happens to be an abundance of blue tiles and plastics in, for instance, the nesting sites of cormorants here. Maybe because of the location in part, because of it being a dumping site, but some studies also show that cormorants are actually more attracted to blue materials. Now, of course, this is interesting to me because of its implications for the geologic record, and it would be interesting to investigate what it would look like if you applied metamorphic conditions. How would this anthropogenic material be preserved in the rock record? And what would those afterlives look like? But I'm also interested in the culture impact of a space like this and more how we imagine them, actually. One aspect of this place that I find really interesting is the definition between the Portlands and the Leslie Spit. These two are attached. It's the same piece of land, and they're made up of the same materials covered with, rebar and rubble beaches. But the Leslie Spit was designated a park in 1995. And almost overnight, this side of the island of trash became treasure. I think about this often happening with time, like sea glass worn down over decades, or we can imagine geologic futures where plastics are appearing in the striations of mountains as anthropological fossils of sorts. But here it happened without a physical change, but with a philosophical one, which turned this pile of waste into a park. And now, despite still being an active dumping ground, it's celebrated widely in the city as a symbol of wilderness, known for its sublime, untamed, feral aesthetic. And with this new title of urban nature, it has access to resources. It has rideshare bikes and research stations to monitor and manage bird populations. There's paved paths and manicured trails to make the park accessible. Meanwhile, the Portlands are still being naturalized. The city is removing 2 million cubic meters of contaminated soil and replacing it with clean fill. And it's a process that'll take decades. And I'm fascinated with this act of moving contaminated earth away as a foundation for a restoration process. You can see You can see here in the lower right a document I found in the Toronto Archives that shows early plans for converting the spit into a park. It includes illustrations of the environment. All of these places now exist, and it also shows how the figure is supposed to feel in it. My favorite is spiritual awe. And now they built those places into the environment. Now there are birding groups that visit the spit all the time, exhibitions about the urban jungle that is the Leslie Spit, et cetera, et cetera. Oops. Sorry. So while this is all happening on the Leslie Spit, a few meters away, the same toxic beach content is still garbage, still being removed and replaced as a part of the naturalization project. And with that, communities of coyotes, birds, plants, and people will be removed and eradicated in order to refill that land and probably develop it. Restoration often means digging into the past and trying to replicate that in the future, and the end results, if ever, rarely match the original state. So I'm wondering what imaginaries shape landscapes like these, and who gets to shape them to decide the spit is nature and the Portlands are not? And what does construction of health or of the natural as an idea do, especially when we're looking at landscapes and materials with such long lifespans, ones that are going to make their toxic way into the geologic record? Thank you.